Damien Blackwell never expected his mystery bride to be her, the woman he once loved and betrayed. Amara Jones returns, veiled in secrecy with a plan of her own. Revenge, redemption, or something neither expected? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. Damien Blackwell stepped out of his sleek black Mercedes and adjusted his expensive suit. At 35, he had the confidence of a man who had conquered the business world through sheer determination and ruthless decisions. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his cold blue eyes surveyed the Blackwell Industries headquarters, a gleaming skyscraper that represented everything he had worked for. "Mr. Blackwell, your grandfather is waiting in the conference room," said his assistant, hurrying to keep up with his long strides. Damien checked his watch. He's early. That's never a good sign. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent. Damien mentally prepared himself for whatever Ernest Blackwell had to say. His grandfather was the only person who still intimidated him, the patriarch who had built the Blackwell fortune from nothing and who still controlled the majority shares of the company. The conference room doors opened to reveal Ernest Blackwell, a stern 80-year-old man sitting at the head of the table. Despite his age, his presence commanded attention. "Grandfather," Damien nodded, taking a seat. "To what do I owe this unexpected meeting?" Ernest didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I'm dying, Damien." The blunt statement hung in the air. "The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less," Ernest continued, "which means we need to discuss succession plans." Damien straightened in his chair. "I'm ready to take over. I've been running operations for the past 5 years. "You're not ready," Ernest cut him off. "You understand business, but you don't understand life. You've become cold calculating, just like your father." Damien's jaw tightened. Comparisons to his father, who had abandoned the family when Damien was just 10, were never welcome. "What does that have to do with the company?" Damien asked. Ernest slid a document across the table. "My will. I'm leaving everything to you, the company, the properties, the majority shares, but there's a condition." Damien skimmed the document, then looked up sharply. "Marriage? You can't be serious." "Deadly serious," Ernest replied. "You need someone to remind you that life isn't just about profit margins and hostile takeovers. You need balance." "This is ridiculous. It's the 21st century, not the Middle Ages." Ernest's weathered hand thumped the table. "Those are my terms. Get married within 3 months, stay married for at least a year, or watch control of Blackwell Industries go to the board of directors." He smiled thinly. "And before you think of arranging some sham marriage, know that I'll be watching carefully." Damien stood up, fuming. "And who exactly am I supposed to marry on such short notice? I don't have time for dating." "Actually," Ernest said, his tone softening slightly, "I might have a solution." Across town, in a modest apartment, above a small bookstore, Amara Jones sat surrounded by stacks of unpaid bills. At 32, she had the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her long brown hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and worry lines creased her otherwise youthful face. The phone rang, and she answered without checking who was calling. "Hello? Amara. It's Margaret Williams." Amara smiled, recognizing the voice of her former literature professor. "Mrs. Williams, it's so good to hear from you. How are you?" "I'm well, dear, but I'm calling about you. How's your father?" Amara glanced at the closed bedroom door where her father slept. "Not good. The treatments are expensive and—" She trailed off, not wanting to burden her mentor with her problems. "That's actually why I'm calling," Margaret said. "I think I might have a solution to your financial troubles. It's unconventional, but it could help." "I'm listening," Amara said, desperate for any way out of her mounting debt. "Do you remember Ernest Blackwell? My husband Richard was his friend for many years before he passed. Ernest has a grandson." Amara froze at the mention of that name. "Blackwell?" "Yes, Damien Blackwell. Ernest is looking for a suitable wife for his grandson. It's a condition for his inheritance." "And what does this have to do with me?" Amara asked, though she already knew what was coming. "Ernest is willing to offer a substantial sum to the woman who agrees to marry Damien. Enough to cover your father's medical expenses and then some." Amara's laugh was hollow. "You want me to marry a stranger for money?" Not exactly a stranger, Margaret said hesitantly. You and Damien met once at that charity event I hosted 5 years ago, but there's something else you should know. What's that? Ernest has arranged. It's so Damien won't know who his bride is until the wedding day. The woman will wear a veil that won't be lifted until after the vows are exchanged. Amara stood up, pacing around her small living room. This is crazy. Why would anyone agree to such terms? Because Ernest is offering $2 million up front, and more if the marriage lasts at least a year. The amount made Amara's head spin. That kind of money would save her father's life, pay off their debts, and secure their future. Why me? Amara finally asked. Ernest wants someone with character, someone educated and kind. I recommended you. Margaret paused. But there's something you should know about Damien. I know exactly who Damien Blackwell is. Amara interrupted, her voice suddenly cold. We didn't just meet once. We dated for 6 months. There was silence on the other end of the line. Oh dear, Margaret finally said. I had no idea. He doesn't remember me, Amara said bitterly. I was just another faceless intern at his company. When I refused to compromise my ethics for one of his business deals, he fired me and ended our relationship in the same breath. Amara, if I had known... No, Amara interrupted again, an idea forming in her mind. Actually, this might be perfect. What do you mean? Amara looked at the picture of her sick father on the side table. Then her eyes drifted to the small filing cabinet where she kept documents she'd secretly copied before being fired from Blackwell Industries. Documents that proved Damien's involvement in some questionable business practices. Tell Ernest I'll do it. I'll marry his grandson. 2 months later, Damien stood in the Blackwell Estate's private chapel, tugging uncomfortably at his bow tie. This wasn't how he had imagined his wedding day, if he had ever imagined it at all. Stop fidgeting, his best friend and business partner Marcus whispered. You look like you're heading to the gallows, not your wedding. Might as well be, Damien muttered. I still can't believe I agreed to this. $2 billion in company. Shares tends to be very persuasive, Marcus remarked dryly. Damien glanced around at the small gathering of guests, mostly business associates and family friends. His grandfather sat in the front row, looking smug and satisfied. The old man had refused to tell Damien anything about his mystery bride, except that she was educated, kind, and from a good family. And from a good... Have you at least seen a picture? Marcus asked. No, grandfather insists on maintaining this ridiculous charade until the last moment. The music started and the guests rose. Damien turned toward the entrance, curious despite himself. The woman who entered was dressed in an elegant, simple white gown that flowed around her slender figure. A delicate lace veil covered her face completely, revealing only a hint of dark hair underneath. She walked slowly, gracefully, clutching a bouquet of white roses. Something about her seemed familiar, but Damien couldn't place it. As she reached his side, he searched for her eyes through the veil but could see only shadows. The ceremony proceeded, and Damien repeated his vows mechanically. When it was the bride's turn, her voice was soft but steady. There was something about that voice. You may now kiss the bride, the minister announced. The moment had arrived. Damien lifted the veil slowly, and the world seemed to stop. Staring back at him were the warm brown eyes he had once known so well. Eyes that had once looked at him with love, then with hurt, and now with something he couldn't quite read. Amara? He whispered, stunned. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Hello, Damien. Surprised to see me? Behind them, the guests murmured in confusion. Damien glanced at his grandfather, who looked genuinely shocked. This hadn't been part of the old man's plan. I don't understand, Damien said, keeping his voice low. What are you doing here? I'm becoming your wife, Amara replied simply. Isn't that what you wanted, a business arrangement? The minister cleared his throat awkwardly. The kiss? Damien leaned forward automatically, and Amara turned her head. Slightly so his lips barely brushed her cheek. As they walked back down the aisle together, Damien whispered, We need to talk. Yes, we do, Amara agreed. But not now. We have guests to entertain, husband. The reception was a blur. Damien moved through it on autopilot, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, all while his mind raced. Amara played her part perfectly, smiling, charming the guests, appearing every bit the happy bride. Only Damien could see the steel behind, her smile. When he finally managed to pull her aside into his grandfather's study, his patience had run out. "What kind of game are you playing?" he demanded. Amara's mask of pleasantness dropped. "No game, Damien, just business." "Isn't that what you taught me? That everything is just business? Why would you agree to this? Is it the money? If you needed help, you could have come to me directly." She laughed, a sound without humor. "Come to you? The man who fired me without a second thought? The man who ended our relationship because I wouldn't help him cheat investors?" Damien ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "That was 5 years ago, Amara. I didn't even know if you were still in the city." "Well, I am. And now I'm your wife." She stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "Our arrangement is simple. We stay married for 1 year as your grandfather stipulated. You get your inheritance, I get the money I was promised. After that, we can go our separate ways." "And what if I refuse? What if I tell my grandfather this was a setup?" Amara smiled coldly. "Then I'll have to share some very interesting documents with the SEC. Documents about certain Blackwell Industries practices that wouldn't hold up well to scrutiny." Damien's eyes narrowed. "You're blackmailing me?" "I prefer to think of it as for insurance." She turned to leave but paused at the door. "Oh, and one more thing. I'll be moving into your penthouse tomorrow, as expected of a loving new wife. Don't worry, I don't expect to share your bed. Just your address and your bank account." With that, she was gone, leaving Damien staring after her, a mixture of anger and admiration coursing through him. The shy, principled woman he had once known had transformed into someone formidable, and despite everything, he found himself intrigued. Outside the study, Ernest Blackwell moved away from the door where he had been listening. A slow smile spread across his face. "Well played, young lady," he murmured to himself. "Well played indeed." The morning after the wedding, Damien woke up on the couch in his study. Empty whiskey glass in hand, he groaned as the events of the previous day came flooding back. Amara Jones, now Amara Blackwell, was his wife. The woman he had once cared for, then dismissed from his life, was now legally bound to him. He checked his watch. 7:30 a.m. Damien was always up early, a habit formed from years of determination to outwork everyone else. He made his way to the kitchen, desperate for coffee, and stopped short. Amara was already there, dressed in jeans and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back. She was making coffee and looked completely at home in his sleek, modern kitchen. "Good morning, husband," she said without looking up. "Sleep well?" "How did you get in?" Damien asked, ignoring her question. "Your grandfather's assistant dropped off a key this morning." She poured coffee into a mug and slid it across the counter to him. "Black, no sugar. You still take it that way, right?" The fact that she remembered such a small detail caught him off guard. "Yes." Damien took the coffee and studied her. In the morning light, with her guard slightly lowered, she looked more like the Amara he remembered, the intelligent, determined woman who had caught his attention 5 years ago when she was just an intern with innovative ideas. "I had my things moved in while you were sleeping," she continued. "Don't worry, I took the guest bedroom at the end of the hall." "Amara," Damien said, setting down his mug, "we need to talk about this situation rationally. There's nothing to discuss. The terms are simple. We stay married for 1 year, you get your inheritance, I get the money your grandfather promised me, and then we divorce. And the documents you mentioned? The ones you're threatening to take to the SEC?" Amara's eyes hardened. "Insurance, in case you decide to back out of our arrangement." "I don't back out of deals," Damien said coldly. "Unlike some people, I honor my commitments. That's rich coming from you." She laughed bitterly. The doorbell rang, interrupting their tense exchange. "Expecting someone?" Amara asked. "No." Damien walked to the door, Amara following a few steps behind. When he opened it, Ernest Blackwell stood in the hallway, leaning on his cane and looking pleased with himself. "Grandfather," Damien said, surprise evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" "Checking on the newlyweds, of course." Ernest stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. His sharp eyes took in the scene, Damien in yesterday's rumpled Clothes, Amara fully dressed and composed. "Good morning, Amara." "Mr. Blackwell," she greeted him with a warm smile that Damien hadn't seen directed at himself. "Would you like some coffee?" "That would be lovely, my dear." As Amara went to the kitchen, Ernest turned to Damien with raised eyebrows. "You look terrible." "Can you blame me?" "You orchestrated this whole thing." Ernest shook his head. "No, I didn't. I had no idea you knew each other. Margaret Williams recommended Amara, and I trusted her judgment." Margaret Williams, Amara's former professor. "Yes, an old friend of mine, but she never mentioned you two had a history." Damien ran a hand through his hair. "Well, we do, and it's not a good one." "Clearly," Ernest said dryly, "but perhaps that's even better. Second chances are rare in life, Damien. This isn't a second chance, it's blackmail." "Blackmail?" Ernest's eyebrows shot up. Before Damien could explain, Amara returned with coffee for Ernest. "Here you go, Mr. Blackwell." "Please call me Ernest. We're family now." She nodded, though Damien could see the hesitation in her eyes. "I came to invite you both to dinner tonight," Ernest continued, "at the family estate. The board members will be there and they're eager to meet Damien's new wife." "We'd be delighted," Amara answered before Damien could refuse. "Perfect. 7 p.m. Ernest set down his barely touched coffee. "I should be going. Doctor's appointments. You know how it is." He walked to the door, then turned back. "Oh, and Damien, you might want to shower and change. You have a company to run and appearances matter." After Ernest left, Damien turned to Amara. "You had no right to accept that invitation." "Of course I did. I'm your wife and this is a business arrangement. I'm playing my part." She crossed her arms. "Besides, I need to meet the board members. They're important to our plan." "Our plan? What exactly are you up to, Amara?" She smiled mysteriously. "You'll see. In the meantime, your grandfather is right. You should get ready for work." She glanced at her watch. "I have to go too. My father has a doctor's appointment." "Your father? What's wrong with him?" Something flashed in Amara's eyes. Vulnerability, perhaps. "Cancer. Stage 4. The treatments are expensive, which is why—" She trailed off. "Which is why you agreed to marry me," Damien finished, understanding dawning. "The money." "Yes, the money," she confirmed, her voice steady again. $2 million can buy a lot of treatment." Damien felt a pang of sympathy, which he quickly suppressed. "I'll see you at 6:30. We'll go to my grandfather's together." Amara arrived at the small hospital room where her father was waiting. James Jones looked up from his book and smiled weakly at his daughter. "There's my girl," he said, his voice frail but his eyes bright. "Or should I say, Mrs. Blackwell now?" Amara kissed his forehead. "News travels fast. Margaret called me. She's worried about you." He studied her face. "Are you sure about this, sweetheart? Marrying a man like Damien Blackwell? It's just for a year, Dad, and the money will pay for your treatments, clear our debts, and give us a fresh start." She forced a smile. "Besides, it's not like we'll be a real couple." James shook his head. "Money isn't everything, Amara. I don't want you sacrificing your happiness for me." "I'm not," she insisted. "This is also about justice." Her father frowned. "What do you mean?" Amara hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "Before Damien fired me, I discovered some documents. He was planning to acquire a small pharmaceutical company called Medcor, then gut it for patents and close down their most promising research. Research for a cancer treatment similar to what you're receiving now." "Amara," her father warned, "whatever you're planning, I'm going to stop him, Dad. Not just for us, but for all the people who would benefit from Medcor's research." She looked down at the folder. "With access to his home and the company as his wife, I can gather evidence of the manipulation he's planning. Then I'll expose him to the board." James took her hand. "Revenge is a dangerous game, especially when mixed with personal feelings." "This isn't about personal feelings," Amara insisted, though her racing heart whenever she thought of Damien suggested otherwise. "It's about doing what's right." "Just be careful," her father said. "The Blackwells are powerful and you're playing with fire." That evening, Damien waited in the living room of his penthouse, checking his watch impatiently. It was 6:25. and Amara still hadn't emerged from her room. Just as he was about to knock on her door, she appeared. Damien's breath caught. Amara was wearing a deep blue evening dress that hugged her curves before flowing elegantly to the floor. Her hair was styled in soft waves, and subtle makeup enhanced her natural beauty. "You look—" He struggled to find an appropriate word. That wouldn't reveal too much. "Presentable," she supplied with a hint of amusement. "Beautiful," he said honestly. Something flickered in her eyes, surprise, perhaps even pleasure, before she masked it. "Thank you. You clean up well yourself." The drive to the Blackwell estate was mostly silent. Damien stole glances at Amara, trying to reconcile this poised woman with the young intern he had known 5 years ago. "We should establish some ground rules," he finally said, "for appearances, such as, the board members will expect us to act like a couple in love. They know about my grandfather's condition for the inheritance." "So you want me to pretend I'm madly in love with you?" Amara asked, arching an eyebrow. "Just act natural, like we care for each other. Can you do that?" She turned to look out the window. "I'm a better actress than you might think, Damien." The Blackwell estate was lit up beautifully as they arrived. Ernest greeted them at the door, looking stronger than he had that morning. "Amara, you look stunning," Ernest said, taking her hand. "Damien is a lucky man." "Thank you, Ernest," she replied warmly. Inside, board members and their spouses mingled in the grand living room. Damien recognized all 12 members. Most were old friends of his grandfather. A few were business associates he had brought in himself. "Let me introduce you," Damien said, placing his hand gently on the small of Amara's back. He felt her tense slightly at his touch before relaxing. They made their way around the room. Amara charmed everyone she met, showing genuine interest in their conversations and asking insightful questions about the company. Damien found himself impressed by how easily she navigated the room full of powerful business figures. "And this is Victor Reeves," Damien said, introducing her to the last board member. "He's our newest addition." Victor, a handsome man in his 40s, kissed Amara's hand. "The pleasure is all mine, Mrs. Blackwell. Damien has been keeping you a secret." "It was a whirlwind romance," Amara replied smoothly, slipping her arm through Damien's. "When you know, you know." "Indeed," Victor said, his eyes lingering on Amara a little too long for Damien's comfort. "I hope we'll be seeing more of you at company functions." "Actually," Ernest announced, joining their conversation, "Amara will be working at Blackwell Industries." Damien turned to his grandfather in shock. "What?" Ernest smiled innocently. "Didn't I mention it? I've arranged for Amara to head our new community outreach division. With her background in business ethics and her work with non-profits, she's perfect for the role." Amara looked as surprised as Damien felt. I don't know what to say." "Say, yes," Ernest urged. "The position starts next week." Damien pulled his grandfather aside as soon as he could. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "You can't just create a position for her." "I didn't," Ernest replied calmly. "The board approved the new division last month. We need someone like Amara to improve our public image, especially after those pollution allegations." "So this isn't about pushing us together?" Ernest smiled enigmatically. "Everything I do has multiple purposes, my boy. You should know that by now." Dinner was served in the formal dining room. Damien found himself seated next to Amara with Ernest at the head of the table. Throughout the meal, he was conscious of how natural it felt to have her beside him, how easily they fell into a rhythm of shared glances and complimentary comments. During dessert, one of the board members asked how they met. "Actually," Amara said before Damien could speak, "we first met 5 years ago. I was an intern at Blackwell Industries." Damien stared at her. She was skating dangerously close to the truth. "Damien was too busy to notice me back then," she continued, with a small laugh. "But we reconnected recently at a charity function and, well, the rest is history." "Love finds a way," Victor commented, raising his glass. "To the happy couple." Everyone joined in the toast, and Damien found Amara's eyes on him as they drank. There was a challenge in her gaze, as if daring him to contradict her story. After dinner, the guests moved to the terrace for coffee and drinks. Damien was cornered by several board members discussing quarterly projections. when he noticed Amara slip away with Victor Reeves. He excused himself and followed them into the library, staying out of sight. "Very interested in your perspective," Victor was saying as Damien approached the doorway. "I have concerns about the Medcore acquisition," Amara replied, "particularly the plans for their research division." Damien froze. How did she know about Medcore? The acquisition was still in its early stages, not yet public knowledge. "Your husband didn't mention your interest in pharmaceutical research," Victor said. "My father is receiving experimental treatments," Amara explained. "I've become quite familiar with the field out of necessity." "I see. Well, perhaps we could discuss this further, maybe over lunch next week." "I'd like that," Amara said. Damien stepped into the library, making his presence known. "There you are. My grandfather is asking for us." Victor nodded politely and excused himself, leaving Damien alone with Amara. "What was that about?" Damien demanded once Victor was out of earshot. "Just getting to know my husband's colleagues," Amara replied innocently. "And Medcore. How do you know about that deal?" Her expression turned serious. "I make it my business to know when someone's planning to destroy research that could save lives, my father's included." "That's what this is about? Your father's treatment?" Damien ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Amara, you don't understand the full picture." "Then explain it to me," she challenged. Before he could respond, Ernest appeared at the door. "There you are. The photographer is here for family pictures." "Photographer?" Damien questioned. "For the company newsletter and annual report," Ernest explained. "Come along, newlyweds." As they walked back to the main room, Damien whispered to Amara, "This conversation isn't over." "It never is with us, is it?" she replied softly. The photographer positioned them in front of the fireplace, Ernest seated in his chair with Damien and Amara standing behind him. "Closer together," the photographer instructed. "Mr. Blackwell, put your arm around your wife." Damien complied, his arm circling Amara's waist. He felt her breath catch as he drew her against him. "Perfect!" the photographer exclaimed. "Now look at each other, like you're in love." As they turned to face one another, their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. For a moment, the pretense fell away, and they were just Damien and Amara again. Two people who had once cared deeply for each other. "Beautiful," the photographer murmured, capturing the moment. Later, as they drove back to the penthouse, silence filled the car again, but it was a different kind of silence, charged with unspoken emotions and lingering questions. "Your father," Damien finally said. "What kind of cancer does he have?" Amara looked surprised by his interest. "Pancreatic, stage 4. The doctors gave him 6 months, but that was 8 months ago. He's fighting hard." "And the treatment? It's experimental?" She nodded. "A new drug combination from Medcore's research division. It's showing promise, but it's expensive and not covered by insurance," Damien finished. "Yes." Damien was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I'll look into it." "What does that mean?" Amara asked warily. "It means I'll look into it," he repeated firmly. "I'm not the monster you think I am, Amara." They arrived at the penthouse, and Amara stepped out of the car before he could say anything else. "Thank you for a lovely evening," she said formally, as if speaking to a stranger. "I'm tired. Good night, Damien." As she disappeared into her bedroom, Damien stood in the hallway, conflicted. His marriage to Amara was supposed to be a simple business arrangement, a means to secure his inheritance. But nothing about Amara Jones had ever been simple, and as much as he tried to deny it, the feelings he thought he'd buried years ago were beginning to resurface. In her room, Amara leaned against the closed door, her heart racing. Tonight had been more difficult than she'd anticipated. Playing the role of Damien's loving wife, feeling his arm around her waist, seeing the occasional glimpses of the man she had once fallen for. She took out the folder of documents from her bag and stared at it. Her plan had seemed so clear this morning. Marry Damien, gather evidence, expose his unethical business practices, and get justice for her father and countless others who could benefit from Medcore's research. But now, faced with the complexity of the man himself, with his promise to look into her father's treatment, with the undeniable connection they still shared, Amara sighed and put the folder away. One thing was certain. This year of marriage was going to be far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The next week passed in a strange dance of avoidance and pretense. Damien and Amara rarely saw each other at the penthouse. He left early for work, she visited her father at the hospital, and their paths crossed only briefly in the evenings. But at Blackwell Industries, it was a different story. Amara's first day as head of the new Community Outreach Division coincided with the company's quarterly review meeting. Damien found himself watching her from across the conference room as she confidently presented her vision for the division. Blackwell Industries has the resources and influence to make real positive change in our community, she was saying, her voice clear and passionate. I propose we focus on 3 key areas: education, healthcare, and environmental sustainability. The board members were nodding in approval. Even Victor Reeves, usually skeptical of new initiatives, seemed impressed. We'll start with a scholarship program for underprivileged students interested in business and technology, Amara continued. Long term, we can establish partnerships with local schools to improve their STEM programs. As she spoke, Damien couldn't help but remember the young intern who had once pitched similar ideas to him, ideas he had dismissed as idealistic and impractical. Now, hearing her present them with such conviction and detail, he wondered if he had been wrong. Questions, Amara asked as she concluded her presentation. Ernest was the first to speak. Impressive, Amara. What's your proposed budget for these initiatives? She presented figures that were ambitious but reasonable, showing a clear understanding of the company's financial situation. I believe we can allocate those funds, Ernest said, looking around the table. All in favor? The vote was unanimous. Amara caught Damien's eye across the room, a hint of surprise in her expression at his supporting vote. After the meeting, as executives filed out of the conference room, Damien approached her. Congratulations, he said. That was a strong presentation. Thank you, Amara replied, gathering her papers. I'm surprised you supported it. Why? It's good business. Improving our public image, creating goodwill in the community. It makes financial sense. She studied him for a moment. Is that the only reason? Before Damien could answer, Victor Reeves joined them. Amara, that was excellent. I'm looking forward to our lunch tomorrow to discuss your ideas further. Damien felt an irrational surge of jealousy. Lunch? Yes, Amara said coolly. Victor wants to hear more about my concerns regarding the Medcore acquisition. Damien's jaw tightened. I see. Well, don't let me keep you from your plans. As he walked away, he heard Victor ask, Amara, is everything all right between you two? Newlywed disagreements already? Nothing serious, Amara's voice replied, just adjusting to married life. That evening, Damien arrived home to find the penthouse empty. A note from Amara on the kitchen counter explained she was at the hospital with her father and would be late. He loosened his tie and poured himself a scotch, then noticed a folder on the coffee table. Curiosity got the better of him, and he flipped it open. Inside were medical records for James Jones, Amara's father. Treatment summaries, hospital bills, and doctor's reports detailed his battle with pancreatic cancer. The bills were staggering, over $500,000 already, with more treatments needed. Buried among the medical papers was a photo of Amara and her father, taken perhaps a year earlier. They were laughing together in a garden, both looking carefree and happy. Before the cancer diagnosis, Damien guessed, he picked up his phone and called Marcus. I need everything you can find on Medcore Pharmaceuticals, he said, without preamble, particularly their cancer research division. The acquisition is already in motion, Marcus replied, confused. We've been over the reports. I want new reports, Damien interrupted. Independent evaluations of their research, and I want them by tomorrow morning. This is about your wife, isn't it? Marcus asked knowingly. Damien ignored the question. Just get me the information. After hanging up, he sat for a long time, staring at the photo of Amara and her father. The woman in that picture, smiling carefree, was so different from the guarded, determined Amara he was married to now. What had happened to change her? Besides her father's illness and what he had done to her 5 years ago, the sound of the front door opening pulled him from his thoughts. He quickly returned the documents to the folder as Amara entered, looking tired. "You're still up," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "How's your father?" Damien asked. Amara's expression softened slightly. "The same. The doctors are talking about a new treatment combination, but—" She shrugged, the gesture conveying, "What words couldn't?" "I made some calls today," Damien said, standing up, "about Medcore." She tensed immediately. "And?" "I've asked for new reports on their research division. Before any decisions are made about the acquisition, I want all the facts." Amara studied him suspiciously. "Why?" "Just last week you were ready to dismantle the division after the takeover." "Things change," he said simply. "People don't change that easily, Damien." He took a step closer to her. "Don't they? You have. The Amara I knew 5 years ago wouldn't have married a man for his money or blackmailed him with stolen documents. Her eyes flashed with anger, and you pushed her to it. The Damien I knew then wasn't so ruthless that he'd sacrifice life-saving research for profit margins. Is that really what you think of me? That I'd knowingly destroy research that could save lives?" He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Amara, the initial reports indicated the research was failing, that the drug trials were showing minimal results. If that's not the case—" "It's not," she interrupted firmly. "My father is living proof the treatments are working, Damien. Slowly, but they're working." He was given 6 months to live, and it's been 8 already. They stood in tense silence, both breathing hard from the emotional exchange. "Get me the data," Damien finally said. "Not anecdotal evidence, not emotional appeals, hard data. If the research is viable, I'll protect it during the acquisition." Hope and suspicion warred in Amara's eyes. "Just like that?" "Just like that." He hesitated, then added more softly, "Contrary to what you believe, I'm not a monster, Amara." She looked away, her voice barely audible when she spoke. "I never thought you were a monster, Damien. Just a man who chose profit over people, over me." The raw honesty in her words struck him deeply. Before he could respond, she murmured a quiet goodnight and retreated to her bedroom. The next day, Amara met Victor Reeves at an upscale restaurant near the Blackwell Industries headquarters. He greeted her with continental charm, kissing her hand and pulling out her chair. "You look lovely today, Amara," he said as they settled at the table. "That color suits you." "Thank you, Victor." She smiled politely, keeping her focus on the purpose of their meeting. "I appreciate you taking the time to discuss Medcore." "Of course, though I must admit, I'm curious about your interest in the acquisition." He studied her over his menu. "Is it purely because of your father's treatment?" Amara was careful with her answer. "Partly, but I also believe in the ethical responsibility of companies like Blackwell Industries. Medcore's research could help thousands of patients." Victor nodded thoughtfully. "I agree. In fact, I've had concerns about Damien's approach to this acquisition from the beginning." This surprised Amara. "You have?" "Damien is brilliant at business, but sometimes he focuses too much on the bottom line." Victor leaned forward. "Between us, I think Ernest's health concerns have made Damien even more aggressive in his business strategies. He's desperate to prove himself worthy of the inheritance." Amara absorbed this information, wondering if it was true. Had Damien's behavior been influenced by pressure from his grandfather? "The board has the power to overrule Damien on the Medcore decision," Victor continued. "But we would need compelling evidence that the research is worth preserving." "I can get that evidence," Amara said quickly. "Medical records, trial results, patient outcomes." Victor raised an eyebrow. "That would be extremely helpful. If you could provide that documentation, I could present it to the board members I trust." "When do you need it by?" "The acquisition committee meets next week. Before then would be ideal." He reached across the table and patted her hand. "Damien is lucky to have someone like you in his life, Amara. Someone with principles." Throughout lunch, Victor continued to be charming and supportive, expressing his admiration for her community outreach plans and offering to help navigate the corporate politics at Blackwell Industries. As they were finishing their coffee, Victor's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned. "Is something wrong?" Amara asked. Just a message from Damien. Apparently he's requesting a delay on the Medcore acquisition decision. Victor looked genuinely surprised. He wants to re-evaluate the research division's potential. Amara's heart skipped a beat. Really? Yes. He's never done anything like this before. Victor studied her with new interest. Amara, have you already spoken to Damien about your concerns? Briefly, she admitted. Victor's expression turned calculating. I see. Well, this is unexpected, but it could be good news for your father's treatment program. On the taxi ride back to Blackwell Industries, Amara found herself confused by her own emotions. She should be happy that Damien was reconsidering the Medcore acquisition, but something about Victor's reaction bothered her. He had seemed almost disappointed by the news, and more importantly, Damien had actually listened to her. He had taken action based on her concerns. It was unexpected and touching. That evening, Damien arrived home later than usual to find Amara in the kitchen cooking. The domestic scene caught him off guard. The smell of garlic and herbs filling the air, soft music playing. In the background, Amara with her hair down and an apron tied around her waist. You cook? He asked, setting his briefcase down. She looked up, a hint of a smile on her lips. Surprised? A little. He moved closer, peering over her shoulder at the simmering pots. It smells good. It's nothing fancy, just pasta with my father's marinara recipe. She stirred the sauce thoughtfully. He always said food was the best medicine. How is he today? Better, actually. His doctor was encouraged by the latest test results. She hesitated, then added, Thank you, by the way, for delaying the Medcore decision. Damien leaned against the counter. Victor told you. Yes, at lunch. She turned to face him fully. Why did you do it? Because you asked me to, he answered simply. Then, seeing her skeptical expression, he sighed, and because Marcus found some discrepancies in the original research evaluations, it seems someone deliberately downplayed the success rates of the trials. Amara's eyes widened. Who would do that? We're investigating, but it means you were right. The research is more promising than we were led to believe. She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. So you'll protect the research division during the acquisition. If the new reports confirm what we suspect, yes, it would be both ethically and financially irresponsible to shut down a promising cancer treatment program. Relief washed over Amara's face, followed by confusion. I don't understand. If you're willing to protect the research now, why were you planning to shut it down before? Because I was given misleading information, Damien explained. I'm not in the habit of examining every detail personally. I rely on reports from people I trust. His expression hardened. Someone betrayed that trust. Amara turned back to the stove, but not before Damien caught a glimpse of guilt in her eyes. You still don't believe me, he observed. I want to, she admitted softly. But 5 years ago you fired me for challenging you on ethical grounds. You made it very clear that profit came first. 5 years is a long time, Amara. People change. He moved to stand beside her. And for what it's worth, firing you was one of my bigger regrets. She looked up at him, surprise evident in her expression. You never tried to contact me afterward. I thought you wouldn't want to hear from me. He held her gaze. Was I wrong? The timer on the oven beeped, breaking the moment. Amara turned away quickly, her cheeks flushed. Dinner's ready, she said, her voice slightly unsteady. Would you like some wine? They ate at the kitchen island, the conversation turning to safer topics. Work, the community outreach program, memories of favorite restaurants. For the first time since their unexpected reunion, they were talking like normal people, not adversaries forced into an arrangement. After dinner, as they cleaned, up together, Damien asked, Why did you make dinner tonight? Amara considered the question. I suppose I wanted to thank you for reconsidering Medcore. It means a lot for my father and others like him. I'm glad, Damien said sincerely. And the dinner was excellent. Such high praise from Damien Blackwell, she teased, the wine having relaxed her usual guardedness. I should mark this day on the calendar. He laughed, and the sound surprised both of them. How long had it been since he had genuinely laughed? Since before his grandfather's diagnosis, at least. We should do this more often, he found himself saying. What, dinner? Talking, like normal people. He handed her the last plate to dry. If we're going to be married for a year, we might as well try to get along. Amara seemed to consider this. I suppose that's reasonable. Such enthusiasm, Damien said dryly, but there was no malice in his tone. She smiled in spite of herself. All right, yes, we can try to be friends. Friends, he repeated, testing the word. It felt inadequate somehow, but it was a start. I'd like that. Their eyes met, and for a moment the years between them seemed to disappear. Damien was reminded of how it had felt the first time he saw her, the brilliant young intern with fire, in her eyes and ideas that challenged his own. The moment lengthened, charged with unspoken possibilities. Damien found himself leaning slightly closer, drawn by a force he couldn't name. The shrill ring of Amara's phone shattered the moment. She stepped back quickly, turning away to answer it. Hello? Yes, this is she. Her voice changed suddenly. Tension evident. What? When? I'll be right there. She hung up, her face pale. It's my father. He's taken a turn for the worse. They've taken him to intensive care. I'll drive you, Damien said immediately, already reaching for his keys. You don't have to. I'm driving you, Amara, he said firmly. Let's go. The hospital corridors seemed endless as they hurried toward the intensive care unit. Amara's face was a mask of controlled fear, her steps quickening with each passing moment. At the nurse's station, she identified herself, and they were directed to a room at the end of the hall. Damien hesitated at the doorway, unsure if he should intrude on such a private moment. Go ahead, he told Amara. I'll wait here. She grabbed his hand impulsively. No, please come with me. Surprised by the request, he nodded and followed her into the room. James Jones lay in the hospital bed, connected to various machines that beeped and monitored his vital signs. Despite his illness, Damien could see traces of Amara in his features. The same determined set of the jaw, the same expressive eyes now opened, slightly as they entered. Amara, James whispered, his voice weak but warm. Dad. She rushed to his bedside, taking his hand. What happened? They said you collapsed. Just a minor setback, he assured her, though the strain in his voice suggested otherwise. His gaze shifted to Damien standing awkwardly by the door. And this must be your husband. Amara tensed, clearly uncertain how to introduce Damien in this context. Yes, sir. Damien stepped forward, extending his hand. Damien Blackwell, it's a pleasure to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. James studied him with surprising sharpness for a man in his condition. So you're the young man who broke my daughter's heart. Dad, Amara protested. And now you've married her, James continued, ignoring her objection. Interesting development. Life takes unexpected turns, Damien replied diplomatically. James laughed weakly, which turned into a cough. That it does, son, that it does. A doctor entered then, nodding to Amara. Ms. Jones, good, you're here. We need to discuss your father's condition. Mrs. Blackwell now, James corrected, a hint of mischief in his tired eyes. The doctor looked between Amara and Damien in surprise. Oh, congratulations. In that case, Mrs. Blackwell, could we speak privately? Anything you have to say can be said in front of my husband, Amara replied, the words sounding strange even to her own ears. The doctor nodded. Very well. Your father experienced what we call a cytokine storm, an overreaction of his immune system to the treatment. It's not uncommon with these experimental therapies, but it is concerning given his weakened state. What does that mean for his treatment? Amara asked, her voice steady despite her fear. We need to discontinue the current protocol, the doctor explained gently. There's a newer combination being developed, but it's still in early trials and very expensive. Insurance won't cover it. Amara nodded, her face composed, but her knuckles white where she gripped her father's hand. Cost isn't an issue. Whatever he needs, we'll find a way. Actually, Damien spoke up, Blackwell Industries has connections with several research hospitals. I'd be happy to make some calls, see if we can get Mr. Jones into one of the advanced trial programs. The doctor looked intrigued. That would be extremely helpful, Mr. Blackwell. Consider it done, Damien said with the confidence of a man used to making things happen. After the doctor left, James looked at Damien with newfound respect. That's quite an offer. It's the least I can do, Damien replied sincerely. Amara was watching him with an unreadable expression. Thank you, she said, quietly. James coughed again, looking suddenly exhausted. You two should go home. I'm just going to sleep now, and you both look like you could use some rest too. I'm staying, Amara insisted. Actually, a nurse interjected from the doorway, we need to run some more tests, and visiting hours are... Hover, you can come back in the morning? Reluctantly, Amara kissed her father's forehead. I'll be back first thing tomorrow. Bring your husband, James said, his eyes already closing. I want to get to know the man who married my daughter. In the car, Amara was quiet, staring out the window at the city lights. Damien glanced at her, concerned by her silence. He's going to be all right, he said, trying to sound reassuring. I'll make those calls tonight, the best doctors, the most advanced treatments, whatever he needs. Why are you doing this? Amara asked suddenly, turning to face him. Is it just to ensure I keep my end of our bargain? To make sure I don't go public with those documents? The accusation stung. No, I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. And because... He hesitated, unsure how to express what he was feeling. Because I care about what happens to you, Amara. I always have. She looked away, but not before he saw the tears she was fighting to hold back. I thought I knew what I was doing, she whispered. Marrying you for money, planning to expose your business practices. It seemed so clear. But now... Now? He prompted gently when she didn't continue. Now everything is confused. You're not who I thought you were, or maybe you've changed. Or maybe I never really knew you at all. She wiped away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts. And I'm not sure I know myself anymore, either. Damien reached across the console and took her hand. To his surprise, she didn't pull away. Maybe we could try to figure it out together, he suggested quietly. Get to know each other again. For real this time, not as boss and employee, not as adversaries in a business arrangement, but as to friends. Amara looked down at their joined hands. Friends, she repeated, the same way he had earlier that evening. I'd like to try that. As they drove through the night, hands still linked, Damien felt something shift between them, a tentative truce in a war neither of them had really wanted to fight. But in the shadows of Blackwell Industries, someone else was watching their growing connection with calculating eyes. Someone who had deliberately suppressed the Medcorps research reports. Someone who stood to gain a great deal if Damien and Amara's marriage failed, and that someone was already planning their next move. 2 weeks after James Jones's health crisis, things had settled into a new rhythm. Thanks to Damien's connections, Amara's father had been accepted into an advanced treatment program at a prestigious research hospital. His condition had stabilized, and there was cautious optimism among his medical team. At home, the atmosphere between Damien and Amara had changed. The cold politeness had given way to something warmer, not quite the passion they had once shared, but a comfortable companionship neither had expected. They often shared breakfast before work, drove to the office together, and in the evenings, they would sit in the living room discussing their days. Amara's community outreach division was flourishing, with several initiatives already underway. Damien found himself impressed by her leadership skills and innovative approach. One evening, as they sat on the terrace of the penthouse sharing a bottle of wine, Amara asked the question that had been on her mind. Have you discovered who altered the Medcorps research reports? Damien's expression darkened. Not yet. Marcus is still investigating. Whoever did it covered their tracks well. It has to be someone with significant access and authority, Amara pointed out. A board member, perhaps. That's what concerns me, Damien admitted. It means someone I trust is working against me, against us. The casual use of us didn't escape Amara's notice. It felt strange and yet natural to be aligned with Damien after spending so long viewing him as the enemy. How is the new Medcorps evaluation coming along, she asked. Very well. The research is actually more promising than we initially thought. The new drug combination your father is receiving has shown remarkable results in early trials. Damien took a sip of his wine. When the acquisition is complete, I'm planning to increase funding for the research division, not dismantle it. Amara smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. That's wonderful news. I have you to thank for it, Damien said, his eyes meeting hers. If you hadn't forced me to look more closely at the reports, I might have made a terrible mistake. Forced? You? Amara raised an eyebrow. Is that what we're calling blackmail now? To her surprise, Damien laughed. Well, it was effective, and justified as it turns out. A comfortable silence fell between them as they looked out at the city lights. Then Damien asked, Do you still have them? The documents you were planning to use against me? Amara hesitated, then nodded. Yes, though I'm not sure I would have actually gone through with it. Why not? She considered the question. Because despite everything, I don't think I ever truly believed you were the villain I made you out to be. Misguided sometimes, too focused on profit perhaps, but not malicious. Damien reached across the small table between them and took her hand. I've made mistakes, Amara. Firing you was one of them. I was young and arrogant and threatened by someone questioning my decisions. And now, she asked softly, now I'm trying to be better. His thumb traced circles on her palm. Having you in my life again, it's made me reevaluate a lot of things. The moment was charged with emotions neither was ready to name. Amara gently withdrew her hand, though not without reluctance. It's getting late, she said. We should get some rest. Big day tomorrow with the charity gala. Damien nodded, understanding her need for space. Good night, Amara. As she walked to her bedroom, Amara found herself conflicted. The lines between their business arrangement and genuine feelings were blurring, and it terrified her. What had started as a marriage of convenience was becoming something else entirely, something she hadn't planned for and wasn't sure she was ready to face. Society, the Blackwell Annual Charity Gala, was the social event of the season. Held in the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel, it brought together the elite of the business world for a night of philanthropy and networking. Damien adjusted his bow tie as he waited for Amara in the living room. When she emerged from her bedroom, he felt his breath catch. She was wearing a flowing emerald gown that hugged her curves before cascading to the floor, her hair styled in elegant waves, diamonds sparkling at her throat and ears. You look, he started, struggling to find adequate words. Presentable? She teased, echoing their earlier exchange. Breathtaking, he corrected, his voice sincere. A soft blush colored her cheeks. Thank you. You're quite handsome yourself. The drive to the hotel was filled with comfortable conversation about the gala and the charities it supported. As they pulled up to the entrance, Damien turned to Amara. There will be press inside, he warned. They'll expect us to act like a couple in love. She nodded. I remember how to play my part. That's not... he began, then stopped. Never mind. Let's go. Cameras flashed as they walked the red carpet, Damien's hand resting lightly on the small of Amara's back. They smiled for photographers, posed for society columnists, and answered brief questions about their whirlwind romance. Inside, the ballroom was transformed into a winter wonderland theme, with crystal decorations and white flowers everywhere. Ernest Blackwell was already there, holding court among a group of admirers despite his frail health. Grandfather, Damien greeted him, leaning down to kiss his cheek. How you're looking well. Marriage agrees with you, Ernest observed, his keen eyes taking in the way Damien and Amara stood close together. Both of you, it seems. Amara smiled warmly at the old man. Your grandson is full of surprises, Ernest. As are you, my dear. Ernest patted her hand. I couldn't have chosen better myself. Well, technically I did choose, but I had no idea you two had a history. Speaking of history, a smooth voice interrupted. The lovely Mrs. Blackwell promised me a dance. Victor Reeves stood before them, impeccably dressed in a tuxedo, his charm on full display. Damien felt a flicker of unease. Something about Victor had been bothering him lately, especially since the discovery of the altered MedCorps reports. I believe my wife is having her first dance with me, Victor. Of course, Victor conceded graciously, but I'll claim the second. As Victor walked away, Ernest leaned closer to Damien. Keep an eye on that one. He's been asking a lot of questions about the Medcore acquisition delay. Damien nodded, filing away this information. I will. The orchestra began playing, and Damien led Amara to the dance floor. As they moved together in a slow waltz, her hand in his other hand at her waist, the pretense of their arrangement seemed to fade away. You're a good dancer, Amara remarked, surprised. My grandmother insisted on lessons, said no Blackwell man should step on a lady's toes at a gala. His eyes never left hers as they moved across the floor. You're not so bad yourself. High school prom committee, she explained with a small laugh. I had to learn all the dances to teach the others. As they continued to dance, Damien found himself drawing her closer, their bodies moving in perfect harmony. It felt right, holding her like this, as if the years of separation had never happened. Amara, he said softly, there's something I need to tell you. She looked up at him, her eyes questioning. What is it? But before he could continue, the music ended, and Victor appeared at their side. My dance, I believe, he said, extending his hand to Amara. With a reluctant glance at Damien, Amara allowed Victor to lead her back onto the dance floor for the next song. Damien watched them, a sense of unease growing stronger as he saw Victor lean close to whisper something in Amara's ear. He was distracted by colleagues wanting to discuss business, and by the time he looked for Amara again, she was nowhere to be seen. Neither was Victor. Concern mounting, Damien searched the ballroom, then the adjacent hallways. He finally spotted them in a secluded corner of the terrace, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. Amara's posture was rigid, her face troubled. Damien moved closer, keeping out of sight, and caught fragments of their exchange. You can't be serious, Amara was saying. That would destroy everything. It's already in motion, Victor replied smoothly. The board votes tomorrow. With the evidence I've presented, they'll overrule Damien and proceed with the original plan for Medcore. But the research is valuable. The treatments are working. Victor's laugh was cold. Did you really think this was about the research? It's about control, Amara. Control of Blackwell Industries. Damien had heard enough. He stepped forward, making his presence known. Is that so, Victor? Both Amara and Victor turned in surprise. Damien? Victor recovered quickly, his face a mask of innocence. Amara and I were just discussing the Medcore situation. I heard, Damien said coldly. You've presented evidence to the board behind my back. What evidence exactly? Victor's eyes narrowed. Financial projections showing the research division is a money pit. Lab reports indicating the treatments have minimal efficacy. Documents you would have seen if you weren't so distracted by your new wife. Falsified reports, Damien guessed. Just like the ones that nearly led me to shut down the division in the first place. It was you all along, wasn't it? A slow smile spread across Victor's face. You can't prove anything, and by this time tomorrow, it won't matter. The board will vote to proceed with the acquisition as originally planned. The research division will be dismantled, and your grandfather will see that you've lost control of the company. Why? Amara demanded. What do you gain from this? Everything, Victor replied simply. Ernest's health is failing rapidly. When he sees that Damien can't manage the company effectively, he'll reconsider the terms of his will. And who better to take over than his trusted advisor? Damien's anger was cold and focused. You won't get away with this. I already have. Victor straightened his cuffs. Now if you'll excuse me, I have more networking to do before the big vote tomorrow. As Victor walked away, Damien turned to Amara. Did you know about this? Of course not, she exclaimed, hurt evident in her voice. I just found out myself. Victor asked to speak with me privately, said he had information about my father's treatment. Then he told me what he's done, what he's planning to do tomorrow. Damien believed her. The shock and anger in her eyes couldn't be faked. We need to stop him. How? He said the board meeting is tomorrow morning. Then we work through the night, Damien said determinedly. We gather every piece of real data on the Medcore research, evidence of the falsified reports, everything. We can find? Amara nodded, her mind already racing. My father's medical records would help. They show the treatments are working, and I know some of the researchers at Medcore. They might have documentation of the original trial results. Good. Let's go. Damien took her hand, leading her back toward the ballroom. Now? What about the gala? This is more important. He stopped, turning to face her. Amara, this isn't just about Blackwell Industries or the inheritance anymore. It's about your father and everyone else who needs those treatments. I won't let Victor destroy that for his own ambition. The intensity in his eyes took her breath away. This was the Damien she had fallen for years ago. Passionate, determined, principled. We could lose everything, she warned. If Victor convinces the board, then we lose everything, Damien said simply. But we'll do it fighting for what's right. In that moment, Amara made a decision. She reached up, cupping his face in her hands, and kissed him. It was a kiss 5 years in the making, full of regret for time lost, hope for what might be, and the rush of reconnection. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Damien looked at her in wonder. What was that for? For becoming the man I always knew you could be, she replied softly. Now let's go save your company and my father's life. For the next 12 hours were a blur of activity. They left the gala without explanation, heading first to the hospital to collect James's medical records, then to Damien's office at Blackwell Industries to gather data on the MedCore acquisition. Marcus joined them around midnight, bringing coffee and his expertise in corporate law. Together they built a case against Victor's falsified reports, gathering testimonials from MedCore researchers via late-night video calls and compiling financial projections that showed the true potential of the research division. By dawn, they had a comprehensive presentation ready for the board. As the first light of day filtered through the office windows, Damien looked at Amara, who was reviewing documents with fierce concentration despite her evening gown and the exhaustion evident in her face. "You're remarkable," he said quietly. She looked up, a tired smile on her lips. "We make a good team." "We always did," he replied. "I was too stubborn to see it 5 years ago." Before she could respond, Marcus returned with more coffee. "Board members are starting to arrive. The meeting's in 30 minutes. Damien nodded, standing and stretching his stiff muscles. Time to get changed. He had sent his driver to bring fresh clothes for both of them hours earlier. As they prepared for the meeting, a heavy silence fell between them, each lost in their own thoughts about what the day might bring. "Whatever happens," Damien finally said as they walked toward the boardroom, "I want you to know something." Amara stopped, turning to face him. "What?" "This marriage may have started as an arrangement, but it's become much more than that for me." He took her hands in his. "I lost you once through my own arrogance and ambition. I don't want to lose you again." Emotion welled in Amara's eyes. "Damien, you don't have to say anything now," he interrupted gently. "Let's get through this first. But whatever the outcome, I want a chance, a real chance with you." She squeezed his hands, unable to find words for the tumult of feelings inside her. Instead, she simply nodded, a silent promise to try. The boardroom was tense as they entered. All 12 board members were present, along with Ernest Blackwell, who looked grave, and Victor Reeves, who seemed smugly confident until he saw Damien and Amara enter together, composed and determined. "What is the meaning of this?" Victor demanded as Damien began distributing folders to each board member. "The agenda for today's meeting has changed," Damien interrupted firmly. "Before any vote on the MedCore acquisition, there's evidence the board needs to review." Ernest Blackwell raised an eyebrow. "What evidence, grandson?" "Evidence of deliberate falsification of research reports," Damien stated clearly. "Evidence that the MedCore cancer treatments are not only effective, but potentially groundbreaking. And evidence that someone on this board has been working against the best interests of Blackwell Industries for personal gain." All eyes turned to Victor, who maintained his composure. "These are serious accusations, Damien. Perhaps your personal involvement has clouded your judgment." "See for yourselves," Damien replied, gesturing to the folders. "Everything is documented. The original research reports, testimony from MedCore scientists, medical records showing the efficacy of the treatments, and proof that the reports presented to this board were deliberately altered." For the next hour, Damien and Amara presented their case methodically, leaving no room for doubt. Amara spoke passionately about her father's treatment and the potential to help thousands of other patients. Damien outlined the financial benefits of expanding rather than dismantling the research division. By the time they finished, Victor's confident demeanor had crumbled, replaced by barely concealed panic. "This is preposterous," he sputtered. "A desperate attempt to maintain control." "Actually," one of the older board members interrupted, "the evidence is quite compelling, particularly the comparison of the original lab reports with the ones you presented to us, Victor." Ernest Blackwell, who had remained silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke. "I've heard enough. I move that we vote immediately on two matters. First, to preserve and expand the Medcore Research Division, and second, to remove Victor Reeves from the Board of Directors pending a full investigation into his actions." The vote was unanimous on both counts. As Indy, security escorted a protesting Victor from the boardroom, Ernest turned to Damien and Amara. "You two have done exceptional work," he said, his eyes twinkling, "though I suspect it wasn't just professional dedication that motivated you." Damien looked at Amara, a soft smile on his lips. "No, it wasn't just professional." After the board members dispersed, Ernest remained behind with Damien and Amara. He seemed tired but satisfied. "You know," the old man said thoughtfully, "when I made marriage a condition of your inheritance, this isn't exactly what I had in mind, but I couldn't have hoped for a better outcome." "You mean exposing a conspiracy within the company?" Damien asked. Ernest shook his head. "No, I mean seeing you find something more valuable than money or power, seeing you fight for what's right, not just what's profitable." He looked between them knowingly. "And perhaps finding love in the process?" Amara blushed and Damien cleared his throat awkwardly. "Grandfather, no need to explain." Ernest waved a hand dismissively. "I'm old, not blind. The way you two look at each other, well, it reminds me of how I looked at your grandmother." He stood slowly, leaning on his cane. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to rest. Almost dying does tend to make one appreciate a good nap." After Ernest left, Damien turned to Amara. "We did it." "We did," she agreed, relief evident in her voice. "The research division is safe. My father's treatments will continue, and Victor will face consequences for his actions." Damien took her, hands in his. "There's just one thing left unresolved." "What's that?" she asked, though she already knew. "Us." He drew her closer. "Amara, when I thought we might lose everything today, I realized something. The company, the inheritance, none of it matters compared to the thought of losing you again." Her heart raced at his words. "Damien." "Let me finish," he said gently. 5 years ago, I made the worst mistake of my life when I let you go. I chose profit over principles, business over the woman I was falling in love with. I won't make that mistake again." "What are you saying?" she whispered, hardly daring to hope. "I'm saying that this marriage may have started as a business arrangement, but I want it to be real. I want us to be real." His eyes held hers, vulnerable and sincere. "I'm falling in love with you, Amara. Again. Still, I'm not sure I ever stopped." Tears welled in her eyes. "Even after I blackmailed you? Married you under false pretenses?" He smiled tenderly. "You did what you had to do for your father, and maybe fate was giving us a second chance. I came into this marriage planning to take you down," she admitted, her voice catching. "But somewhere along the way I remembered why I fell for you in the first place. Your brilliance, your determination, your capacity for change." "Is that a yes?" he asked, his heart in his eyes. Instead of answering with words, Amara wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him, a real kiss, full of promise and new beginnings. When they finally broke apart, Damien rested his forehead against hers. "I'll take that as a yes." 6 months later, the garden of the Blackwell estate was in full bloom as family and friends gathered for the renewal of Damien and Amara's vows. Unlike their first wedding, this ceremony was a true celebration of love. Not a business arrangement, not a manipulation, but a choice made with open eyes and full hearts. James Jones, now in remission thanks to the Medcore treatments, proudly walked his daughter down the aisle. Ernest Blackwell, whose health had stabilized with new treatments of his own, beamed from his seat of honor in the front row. As Amara approached in a simple white gown, no veil this time, her face radiant and visible to all, Damien felt his heart swell with gratitude for their unexpected journey. "When we first stood here 6 months ago," the minister began, "these two were strangers in many ways despite their history. Today, they come before us as true partners, having found their way back to each other through challenges that would have broken a lesser love." Damien and Amara exchanged new rings and new vows, promises made not out of necessity or obligation, but out of genuine love and commitment. "I once hid behind a veil," Amara said, her voice clear and strong, "afraid to let you see all of me. Today I stand before you completely revealed, offering you my heart, without reservation or condition." "And I once hid behind ambition and pride," Damien replied, taking her hands in his. "Today, I promise to always see you, truly see you, and to be worthy of your love every day of our lives." As they sealed their renewed commitment with a kiss, the gathered guests erupted in applause. Ernest wiped a tear from his eye, and James Jones nodded in satisfaction. At the reception, as they shared their first dance as a truly married couple, Damien held Amara close, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Beyond words," she replied, her eyes shining with love. "Who would have thought that marriage to a millionaire would turn out like this?" "Billionaire," he corrected with a teasing smile. "And I'm the lucky one. I got a second chance with the love of my life." As they moved across the dance floor, surrounded by friends and family, Amara reflected on the strange twist of fate that had reunited them. What had begun as a marriage of convenience, a veil hiding ulterior motives and old wounds, had transformed into something beautiful and true. Sometimes, she thought, the most unexpected beginnings led to the most perfect endings. And their story was just beginning. In the crowd, Ernest Blackwell watched the couple with satisfaction. His plan had worked better than he could have imagined. Not only had Damien found love and purpose, but Blackwell Industries was thriving under their combined leadership. Damien's business acumen now balanced by Amara's ethical perspective and community focus. The old man smiled to himself. Sometimes, manipulation for the right reasons could lead to wonderful outcomes, though he'd never admit to them just how much he had orchestrated from the beginning, including Margaret Williams' suggestion of Amara as a potential bride. Some secrets, after all, were best kept behind the veil. The end